Welcome to a night the world was never meant to remember. Welcome to South Carolina, 1823, where silence broke its chains and the enslaved dared to answer back. The year was cruel, the air heavy with summer rain and fear. The fields stretched out like an ocean of cane and cotton shimmering under the moon, and beneath that same sky, the voices of the enslaved began to stir. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and the hour you're listening. Because somewhere right now in another time zone, another country, another midnight, the same wind that touched those burning fields is still moving. They say it started as a whisper. One word passed from cabin to cabin, from one trembling hand to another. Freedom. A word that could cost you your life if heard by the wrong ears. But that night, it was no longer whispered. It was sung low, deep, trembling like thunder that hadn't yet found the courage to strike. And then, it struck. The overseers heard it first. The sound of footsteps in unison, not running, not hiding, but moving forward. They called it unrest. The Charleston Gazette would later write only one cold sentence. Disorder reported among plantation workers, situation contained. Contained. That's the word they used. But you can't contain what's been buried in fire and blood for generations. You can't contain a song once it's been set free. Some said the wind carried that song across the rice fields that night. Others swore they heard chains breaking not from hands, but from the earth itself. And long after the fires were put out, old planters told their children not to walk past the swamps after sundown. Because the land, they said, remembers. Folklore still tells of a light that drifted across the fields that summer. A glow that moved without flame, without shadow. Some called it a spirit. Some called it vengeance. But to those who had been enslaved, it was a sign the ancestors had come to walk beside them. No official record mentions the light. No historian confirms it. But there is one document dated July 1823, hidden deep within the Freedmen's Bureau archive, an overseer's letter, unsigned, barely legible through the ink stains. They gathered in the woods, singing of a land beyond the river. I could not stop them. I could not make them fear again. That line, I could not make them fear again. That is where this story begins. Because that night fear changed us. For one fleeting moment, the enslaved stood not as property, not as shadows, but as people burning bright in defiance. And though most would perish by dawn, their cry for freedom echoed far beyond that swamp past, that summer past, even their own names. 200 years later, the soil still hums with what they left behind. No grave markers, no statues, just air heavy with memory. Walk there today, and the cicadas will go quiet, as if listening. Some say, if you press your ear to the ground, you can still hear it, the faint rhythm of feet marching and voices rising in the dark. They say history buried the rebellion, but the rebellion buried history first. Welcome again to the night when the enslaved fought back, to the cry that refused to fade, to a truth that can't be erased by silence. And if you listen closely, you might just hear it. The sound of chains breaking, the sound of a people rising, the sound of freedom finding its voice. Summer 1823, South Carolina. The heat came down like a weight from heaven. The air itself felt alive. Thick humming pressed against the skin like a fever that would never break. Out across the low country, the rice fields shimmered in the distance, cut into the swamps like scars that refused to heal. Spanish moss hung from the trees, gray ghostly, swaying with each whisper of wind like veils moving over the faces of the dead. And in the stillness between the cicadas and the frogs, you could almost hear the rhythm of labor, the shuffle of bare feet in mud, the sigh of breath under chains. The world of the enslaved had no clocks, only the sun that burned and the overseer's voice that broke through dawn. By 1823, South Carolina was a land divided between wealth and terror, between the white mansions on the high ridges and the wooden cabins sinking into the swamp. On one side, silver spoons imported linen church bells, echoing on Sundays. On the other, the silence of those who built it all, yet owned nothing, not even their names. The plantation economy was a perfect machine built on suffering so ordinary that it became invisible. The sound of a whip was no longer shocking. It was part of the rhythm of life. The children on the hill played to its cadence. The dogs didn't even bark anymore when someone screamed. The owners called it order. The preachers called it God's plan. The papers called it the Southern way of life. But down in the fields under the cypress and the damp earth, the enslaved called it something else the long night. A night that stretched across centuries. Each plantation was its own kingdom and its own prison. The overseers rode on horseback, their silhouettes cut against the horizon like vultures waiting to descend. The cabins were small wooden built from the same boards that housed the animals. Inside, a single fire pit glowed dimly at night, surrounded by shadows, families whispering, singing, praying in secret tongues. The songs were soft, so soft they barely reached beyond the walls, but the walls remembered. They always remembered. There was a rhythm to life on those plantations, cruel, deliberate, and never-ending. Sunrise meant labor. Noon meant punishment. Night meant survival. And yet amid all that, there was something else moving quietly through the darkness. A pulse. An invisible heartbeat passed between them. They met in whispers, in looks, in small gestures the overseers could not see. A nod at the well meant it will happen soon. A song sung a little slower meant we're ready. The air itself began to change that summer, heavier than before, charged with something electric and ancient. The swamps around Georgetown County became the meeting ground. To outsiders, it was a hellish place filled with snakes, insects, rot. But to those who had no freedom, it was sanctuary. The marsh muffled footsteps. The fog swallowed voices. It was said that even the moon would not betray them there. In the deepest part of the swamp, near an old oak, the locals called the hanging tree they gathered after sundown. Small groups at first, then dozens. They brought no weapons at the beginning, only tools, farming blades, rusted saws, and faith. Always faith. And under that moon, they sang. Not loudly, never loudly. The songs were prayers disguised as work chants. The kind of songs that made the air tremble. Steal away to Jesus. A spiritual that to outsiders sounded like worship, but to the enslaved was a code, a map, a warning. Every note carried meaning. Every pause told a secret. By July, the plantation owners began to sense something wrong. There were fewer smiles, fewer bowed heads. Eyes lingered too long. Some nights the dogs barked without reason. The air smelled of smoke, though no fires burned. One overseer wrote in his journal, "They look at me now, not with fear, but with waiting. I can feel it." The swamp hums at night. No one listened to him. They never listened to warnings from below. Beyond the plantations, America itself was shifting. The tremors of rebellion were not new. Just 2 years before Denmark Vesey, a free black man in Charleston had been hanged for organizing a slave revolt that authorities claimed would burn the city to the ground. 35 men were executed. The gallows still stood blackened and quiet, a reminder of what happened to those who dared. The authorities thought they had buried the idea of uprising forever. But ideas like spirits don't die. They wait. The word freedom became a ghost that haunted the plantations. It passed from the lips of the elders to the ears of the young. It lived in songs and Bible verses, in whispered stories about Haiti, where slaves had once risen and won. Some even said that the spirits from that island crossed the ocean, carried on the same winds that bent the rice fields of Carolina. Whether truth or superstition, no one could tell, but something was stirring that year, something older than the land itself. In the evenings, as the sun bled over the horizon, the workers gathered at the edge of the fields. The sky turned copper, the air filled with the scent of molasses and ash. And someone would start a tune. Slow at first, low rising with each voice until the field itself seemed to hum. It wasn't rebellion yet, but it was no longer silence. It was memory awakening. A woman named Miriam, remembered only through a single WPA narrative recorded decades later, said, "We ain't talk with words, we talk with our eyes. Eyes say everything. Eyes say, tonight. Eyes say, soon." Those eyes watched the stars each night, not for beauty, but for direction. The North Star was more than light. It was hope and warning and destination. But in 1823, the plan was not to run north. The plan was to rise right here where their blood had soaked into the soil for generations. The plantation owners gathered in parlors, sipping imported wine, unaware that their walls had ears. The enslaved who served them, those who poured their drinks, swept their floors, were listening. Every word about harvest schedules, every mention of guards, every route between estates, memorized, passed along like scripture. A secret gospel of resistance. And then came the rain. That year's summer storms hit harder than usual. Flooding fields, breaking fences, silencing the sound of gunfire from a distance. The overseers cursed the heavens, but the enslaved saw it differently. The Lord's covering, they called it. Rain meant the dogs would lose the scent. Rain meant the night would be theirs. There are no official reports of what happened in those weeks leading to the uprising, but oral histories passed down through generations fill in the gaps. The ledgers refuse to keep. They tell of an elder named Isaac, blind in one eye, who claimed to dream of fire every night. He told the others the ancestors had spoken. "The time's near," he said. "When the storm comes again, we rise." And they believed him, so they prepared quietly, patiently. They forged blades from plowshares, hid tools beneath floorboards, stockpiled food where no one looked. Some made charms from roots and bones, praying for protection. Others carved crosses on the cabin walls, not for God, but for the ones who came before. On the night before it began, they say, the swamp glowed faintly, a strange pale light hovering just above the water, flickering like lanterns carried by unseen hands. The elders said it was the ancestors walking ready to lead them through. The younger ones said it was just swamp gas. But when morning came and the air held that still impossible silence, even the skeptics felt it. Something was coming. The fields waited. The air waited. The land itself waited. And as dusk fell once more, every cabin in that low country seemed to breathe in unison. The long night was about to end. The first record, the only one that survived, came from an unsigned report in the Charleston Gazette, dated June 12, 1823. A single column buried between trade prices and ship arrivals. It read in small print, almost as if embarrassed by its own words. An incident of disorder among Negro laborers has been observed near the lower plantations of Georgetown. Damage minor. Order restored. Order restored. 3 words, as thin as the paper they were printed on. But if you follow the trail beneath that sentence, the ledgers, the estate records, the missing inventory logs, a different story begins to appear. There were fires. 3, maybe 4 plantations all struck in a single night. No witnesses claimed to see the first flame, but a merchant traveling the King's Highway wrote that the horizon glowed red and the sound of drums could be heard in the fog. Drums. The word repeats in multiple sources, one even from a soldier stationed in Charleston, who decades later confessed in an 1865 interview that he remembered being called to quiet a Negro disturbance in the summer of 23. "We marched in darkness," he said. The road was mud. We heard drums soft far away and then screams. But by the time we arrived, the fields were ash. The army report he mentioned was never found. Some historians claim it was destroyed in the Great Fire of 1861. Others say it was hidden, suppressed by men who could not afford to let the idea of rebellion spread. But fragments survive, and each fragment hums with unease. One plantation ledger lists 10 prime field hands missing. Another, in careful handwriting, adds one overseer unaccounted for. There's no record of burial, no record of return. Only a sudden gap, as if the names were swallowed whole. And yet, there is another kind of record, one not written in ink, but in memory. Decades later, when the WPA interviews began in the 1930s, an elderly woman from the same county, Sarah, age 92, spoke of the summer when the sky burned. She said her grandmother had been a child in 1823, hiding in the woods watching the flames from afar. She said the people weren't scared no more, Sarah whispered to the interviewer. They was singing when they should have been running. She said she ain't never heard voices like that again sound like they was singing for the Lord, but crying for the dead at the same time. The interviewer asked her what they sang. Sarah paused, then hummed a low tune. A few trembling notes almost lost to static on the recording. It was the melody of Steal Away, the same song that was already known across the plantations, both prayer and warning. Fact meets echo. And the line between archive and haunting blurs again. A scholar named William H. Dobbins, who cataloged plantation inventories in the 1890s, noticed something else. He found that several estates from that region stopped recording births and deaths altogether in the latter half of 1823, as if the ledgers themselves had fallen silent. He wrote in his notes, "The accounting of souls ceased perhaps by accident or perhaps by design." He never published the findings. He died before his manuscript was complete heart failure, the coroner said. But in the margins of his draft, scrawled hastily, are the words, "The silence is deliberate." That phrase would resurface again almost a century later, when folklorist Zora Neale Hurston visited the same region to collect stories for the Federal Writers Project. She recorded an old man named Elijah, blind toothless voice trembling like wind in the cane, telling her about the night of the red sky. "They burned fields to clean 'em, miss," he said. "But that night it warn't no cleaning. That was calling. They say the dead rose to fight with the living. You believe that?" Hurston never answered. But she wrote in the margin of her notebook a single line. History hides what folklore insists. And that's where Fact Layer Y ends, or maybe begins again. Because even the official archives, the ones preserved in Columbia and Charleston, tell two conflicting stories. In one, the rebellion is contained swiftly minimal loss. In another, a private letter from a judge to the governor, dated August 1823, pleads for reinforcements to quell the Negro uprising, spreading through the Low Country. That letter, written in fine cursive on browned parchment, still carries a faint stain, water or blood. No one can tell. The governor's reply is missing. Only the envelope remains. Meanwhile, local churches began to close their night services. White residents fled inland for several weeks, claiming fever outbreaks. Yet no medical records exist. Only a single sermon printed that summer by Reverend Silas Turner, a slave-holding preacher known for his strict discipline. "Let every man obey his master, for rebellion is the voice of Satan." And yet, "The Lord shall judge the cries of the oppressed." A strange contradiction, guilt seeping through holy words. Folklore, however, refuses the sanitized version. In those same WPA accounts, people spoke of a figure part man, part myth called Old Isaac the Dreamer. They said he could see the future through smoke, that he stood on the hill overlooking the plantation the night it burned, shouting verses from Exodus as the sky turned to fire. Some claimed he vanished in the flames. Others said he was never real at all, just the spirit of freedom itself, wearing a man's face for one night. The records don't list any Isaac among the slaves that year. But in the next census, 1830, a single entry appears on a remote farm 40 miles away, Isaac Black, male age unknown, free. Coincidence or aftermath? No one can say. Another report, handwritten and unsigned, now stored at the South Carolina Historical Society, contains this passage. "It is said they gathered near the hanging tree, men, women, and children alike. They carried torches, tools, and songs. They spared no master who resisted. The fields glowed as though the stars had fallen to earth. And yet the document ends abruptly, mid-sentence, the last line trailing off in ink. The light. The light was not of this world. The rest is missing. Torn, burned, and still that light appears again in letters in local folklore, even in sermons decades later. A flicker in the distance. A pale flame that left no smoke. A phenomenon described by travelers who claim to see it above the marshlands dancing in silence. The scholars call it phosphorescent decay. The locals call it the March of Souls. Two truths side by side. Both impossible, both persistent. And somewhere between them, the real story breathes. In 1823, there was no telegraph, no photographs, no official inquiry. Just ash, just rumor, just silence. But silence leaves marks. The plantations rebuilt new cabins, new chains, new ledgers, but the soil never forgot. The rice never grew quite the same. They said even the cattle refused to graze near the burned fields. Years later, travelers would find old iron collars half buried in mud, fused and twisted as if by heat far greater than any fire could make. Some took them as souvenirs. Others buried them again, whispering prayers they couldn't explain. The rebellion was never named. No monument stands. But under the surface of South Carolina's quiet fields, the evidence remains not in ink, but in vibration. The same rhythm that the enslaved once walked to. The same drumbeat that soldiers heard in the fog. The same pulse that never stopped. History calls it a minor disturbance. Folklore calls it deliverance. And tonight we return to that space in between, where the paper ends but the voices begin. Night came heavy that summer, thick with heat, thick with breath. The kind of night that pressed on your chest and made you feel every heartbeat like a hammer. The cabins sat in clusters, wood blackened from years of rain and smoke, their small windows glowing faintly from within. Crickets sang, the swamp hummed. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled, but never came. It was the sound of waiting, the kind of waiting that has no time in it. Inside one of those cabins near the edge of the rice fields, a woman sat by a dying fire. Her name was Miriam. She was small, worn thin by years of labor, her hands rough as rope. But her eyes carried light. Across from her, a boy slept, maybe 10, maybe 12. His breath shallow, his arms curled tight as if the air could steal him away. Miriam hummed under her breath, low, steady, like a heart still believing. It wasn't a song for sleep. It was a song for courage. Outside, the world was trembling, and in her song she hid the code, the signal, the one the others would know. Steal away, she whispered, not louder than the crackle of the fire. Steal away home. The boy stirred, murmuring something, a dream maybe. "Ma," he said. "They gon' come?" She hesitated. The word come meant many things that summer, the overseers, the soldiers, the storm, or something greater. "Yes, baby," she said softly. "They comin'. But we goin' too." Outside, the sound of a shovel striking dirt echoed. 3 men worked in the dark, sweat gleaming on their foreheads, though the air was still. They weren't digging graves. They were hiding what little they owned, a tin cup, a comb, a Bible missing half its pages, and a small wooden carving shaped like a bird. They buried them under the roots of an oak. If they died, they wanted something to outlast them. An elder, Isaac, they called him, stood nearby. The others said he dreamed things before they happened. He said he didn't dream, he just listened. "The ground talk if you quiet," he whispered. Ground remember what done to it. His voice cracked, his back bent. But his hands were steady when he drew a line in the dirt, the mark that meant soon. Somewhere near the cabins, a young man named Joseph was sharpening a blade, not a weapon, not yet. It was a sugarcane knife, curved and dull at the edge. He pressed it against a stone, slow and deliberate, until sparks danced. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry either. just calm like a man whose decision was already made. He looked up when Miriam stepped outside. Their eyes met, no words, no signal, but something passed between them. The same kind of silence that comes before a storm. She nodded once. He nodded back. Then, the rain started. Soft at first, tapping on the roofs like fingertips. The frogs went silent. Even the wind stopped moving. The air turned cold, sudden, and strange. Miriam stepped back inside and woke the boy. "Get your shoes, baby," she said. "Keep quiet now." The boy blinked, confused. "Where are we going?" "To the woods," she said. "To the people." Fact says there were no survivors. Folklore says otherwise. In the WPA recordings, one old man claimed his great-grandmother had been there that night. She said the sky turned white not from lightning, but from something else. She said the ground shake, he told the interviewer. She said it weren't fear, it was joy. They was tired of kneeling. So they stood. And so they stood. One by one the cabin doors opened. Shadows moved through the rain, gathering in silence. Mothers carried children wrapped in cloth. Old men leaned on sticks. Men who'd been whipped till their backs were maps of scars walked upright, shoulders square. There was no leader, not really. Just the same rhythm in every chest. A rhythm older than the language they were forced to speak. They walked to the swamp's edge, to the hanging tree, where moss draped like mourning veils. There under the branches, Isaac stood waiting. His eyes closed, his lips moving. Not prayer, something else. Something between pleading and command. "You feel it?" he asked them. "That hum in your feet. That's the land remembering. That's our people talking." Someone began to cry. Someone else began to sing. And then, as if on cue, the rest joined in. The sound rose low and rough, 1,000 years of breath finding release in one song. The swamp seemed to shiver with it. The trees swayed though no wind blew. The boy held Miriam's hand, and she squeezed hard. "Don't let go," she said, "no matter what." Nearby, Joseph lifted his blade. It caught the light of a single torch and flared like gold. His heart beat so hard he could feel it in his teeth. He thought of his brother taken years ago and sold downriver. He thought of the overseer's laugh, the smell of blood in the sun. And then, for the first time in his life, he didn't think at all. He moved. They all moved. The sound that followed wasn't a shout, wasn't even a cry. It was a breaking, like the sound of chains pulled too tight, finally snapping, like thunder rolling underfoot. No one knows how many cabins went up that night. The ledgers would never say. But witnesses, the few that survived, spoke of flames that climbed too high, burned too clean. Some swore the fire didn't consume it, cleansed. A woman on the next plantation claimed to see figures walking through the blaze, not burning, not screaming, just walking. The story spread in whispers for generations. Even years later, children dared each other to walk past those fields at night. They said if you were quiet enough, you could still hear them, feet sloshing through mud, a song rising from nowhere. And then, silence. When morning came, the sky was gray and hollow. Smoke drifted over the marsh, clinging low to the ground. The cabins were gone, the fields black. The hanging tree stood alone, its branches wet and heavy. The boy and his mother were never found. Joseph's name appears in no record. Isaac's body was never recovered. But 2 weeks later, in a town 30 miles away, a preacher gave a sermon unlike any other. He said he'd heard voices in his sleep, the singing of those the world had forgotten. He told his congregation, the Lord sent a storm to wash away the chains, but man rebuilt them in his heart. They didn't print that sermon. They called him mad. But he left a note in his Bible before he disappeared. It read, "They walked into the fire, and the fire walked with them." In the decades that followed, families who once worked those same fields told stories by lamplight. They spoke of ancestors who vanished in a single night, and of dreams where they came back, covered in ash but smiling. Sarah, the elderly woman from the WPA archives, said her grandmother would pause every time thunder rolled and whisper, "They comin' home again." It wasn't grief, wasn't fear, it was remembrance. And if you walk through those woods today, there's a stillness you can't explain. The air hums differently. The wind bends the grass like breath. Some nights, even the frogs go quiet all at once. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just the swamp remembering. Or maybe it's them, the people who refused to kneel. The ones who chose fire over silence. The ones whose names were erased, but whose story refused to die. This was their night. And though history calls it rebellion, to them it was finally breathing. Dawn came quietly, too quietly. The mist rolled over Georgetown County like a curtain drawn over shame. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and wet earth and something else, the faint metallic tang of blood mixed with salt from the marsh. The birds didn't sing that morning. The dogs refused to bark. The few survivors who remained said it felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for someone to speak first, but no one did. The first official record of that dawn appears not in a newspaper, but in a letter written by a local magistrate, Elias Thorne, addressed to the governor of South Carolina. Dated June 15, 1823, it reads, "Sir, I regret to report a most unfortunate disorder among the Negro population of the lower plantations. Several estates have suffered grave loss of property. The insurrection, though contained, reveals a disturbing spirit of defiance. I recommend increased patrols and stricter observation of religious gatherings, which seem to serve as the seed of such unrest." Contained again that word, appearing like a reflex as if repetition could make it true. But there was no containment, only silence, a silence that spread like rot. A week later, a ship's captain docking at Charleston noted in his logbook, "Smoke still rises from the inland. Locals whisper of songs in the night. The Negroes look hollow-eyed. Something unholy passed through those fields." The entries stopped there, the following pages torn out. For years, official archives would insist the rebellion was minor, swiftly quelled, forgotten. But the land itself would disagree. The rice fields near the Santee River never grew as they once did. The ground hardened as if scorched beneath. Surveyors in 1840 recorded strange mineral coloration in the soil. Farmers said crops failed no matter what they planted. And then came the stories. A plantation ledger discovered in 1904 in a collapsed barn held an annotation in the margins, a different hand from the rest. Ink faded and jagged. They sang as they burned. The light did not fade till morning. The handwriting belonged to a woman, the widow of a landowner named Thomas Greaves. Her diary, found later, offers more a chilling detail never published. We heard them from the veranda, the voices like a tide coming in. Not screams, not rage, but something else. I cannot write it. The Lord forgive me, but for a moment I thought I saw angels in the fire. That page was stained rain, perhaps, or tears. The Charleston Gazette, cautious as ever, printed only an apology to its readers for delays in the reporting of regional matters due to weather. No mention of the rebellion. But in the personal letters between editors, kept now at the South Carolina Historical Society, one note reads, "Governor demands discretion." The flames were seen from 10 miles off. Must not let Charleston panic. Discretion, another word for erasure. And yet in the shadows of that silence, folklore began to take root. It grew in the mouths of those who survived, passed on in whispers, sung in work songs, hidden in sermons disguised as psalms. They spoke of Isaac the dreamer, the old man who had led them to the hanging tree. The official record never named him, but among the enslaved who lived to tell the story, he became more than a man. They said he walked through the flames without fear, his staff burning bright like lightning, and that when the soldiers arrived, they found no body. Only a trail of ash that led into the swamp and disappeared. In Reconstruction-era folklore, His name changed from Isaac to the walking preacher to the fire prophet to he who returns when the land trembles. Every decade the story shifted, but the core remained a man who rose in the fire and never fell again. The earliest written version appears in the WPA archives in the handwriting of a field interviewer named C.L. Hunter. He recorded a testimony from an old woman named Dinah who had been born a slave in the 1830s, just a few miles from the old rebellion site. She said, "Mama told me the man was blind on one side. He's seen the world of the living with one eye and the world of the spirits with the other. When he preached, the trees listened. When he sang, the river moved. When he called, they all came." Hunter underlined that last phrase, "they all came," and then added a note to himself. Local clergy discourage this story claim. It causes unrest. Unrest, the word that keeps returning century after century, whenever the truth threatens to breathe again. By the 1870s, new settlers who moved into the region began reporting strange happenings, lights drifting over the swamp at night, voices humming in the cane fields, drums echoing where no one stood. Scientists would later call it marsh gas, a trick of decay and heat. But the older black families had another explanation. "It ain't gas," one man said. "It's memory." One pastor from a freedmen's church in Georgetown, Reverend Samuel Kane, wrote in his 1878 journal, "We held service near the old fields last night. In the distance, we saw a glow like lanterns moving across the dark. But when we went to meet them, the light withdrew into the trees. Some say it was God's sign. I say it was our ancestors still walking home." He never mentioned it again, but the next week his entry stopped mid-sentence. His Bible, found years later in a trunk, contained a note pressed between the pages. "The swamp sings." Historians dismiss such things, of course. They prefer numbers, casualty count, census data. But numbers lie, or rather they tell only half a truth. There's another archive, the one you can't catalog, the one written in sound, in soil, in stories that refuse to die. Fact Layer 2 reveals the paradox that the more you search for records, the more they dissolve. The rebellion exists like breath on glass, visible for a moment, gone when you reach to touch it. One military memo from the summer of 1823, signed only with initials CR, speaks of the confiscation of corpses for examination. It notes anomalous burns, bodies not charred but whitened as if by a heat without flame. The report ends with a line that has haunted every researcher since: "We buried what we could not understand." When that document resurfaced in the 1950s, the archive labeled it unverified. But in the same folder lies a black and white photograph of the original edges. Burnt handwriting faded, a fingerprint in the corner. Around the same time, anthropologist Margaret Smith traveled through the Carolinas, collecting remnants of slave spirituals. In one forgotten parish, she found a congregation that sang a song not found anywhere else. Its refrain went, "Fire walk, children, fire walk slow, the Lord done freed the chains below." When she asked its origin, the deacon only smiled and said, "That one ain't in no book." And then, perhaps the strangest document of all, a Freedmen's Bureau field report from 1866, describing Reconstruction troubles near the same marshlands. Freed Negroes refused to cultivate the lower fields, claiming the ground still breathes fire. One elder woman states she sees figures in the fog each morning, advises me not to go near after dark. The investigators signed off reluctantly. Superstition rampant, but atmosphere indeed oppressive. Even outsiders felt it, the heaviness of the place, the air too still, too charged. When railroads came through the region in the 1880s, the workers refused to cut through the hanging tree area. They rerouted the line 2 miles west. No one said why, but in a letter to his wife, one foreman wrote, "The men hear singing where there should be none. I don't ask questions." History official printed approved calls it folklore, but folklore is what survives when history forgets. 2 centuries later, archaeologists still find traces. Iron melted into impossible shapes, glass fused to stone, fragments of chains blackened beyond recognition. Soil samples show unusual chemical composition. Traces of phosphorus, traces of salt, traces of bone. But when asked to explain, the scientists shrug. Old burn sites, they say. And yet, every year, on the anniversary of the rebellion, though no one can agree on the exact date, locals claim to see light moving across the fields. A pale glow rising just before dawn, vanishing when the first bird sings. Some call it the marsh fire. Others call it the March of Souls. One journalist who visited in 1974 wrote, "It's like standing in a church with no roof. The air alive, vibrating, as if something unseen is still praying. Even now, the county keeps no marker, no memorial. The land is sold, divided, developed. But the stories remain like roots that keep growing after the tree is gone. And if you stand there long enough, at dusk, and the world goes still, you'll hear it, the faint rhythm of feet moving in mud, slow, steady, endless. The same rhythm that shook the empire 200 years ago. The same rhythm that keeps whispering to every ear that will listen. We are not gone." Fact ends here, but memory continues. And sometimes, memory tells the truest story of all. Time folds strangely here. 200 years later, and still the air in Georgetown County moves the same way. The swamp hasn't changed, not really. The moss still hangs like shrouds over the cypress. The earth still drinks rain the same way it once drank blood. Even the wind carries a weight to it, like it knows what happened and dares not speak too loud. A historian named Ruth Hensley came here in the summer of 1983, a professor from Howard University, chasing fragments of the past. She had read the letters, the ledgers, the WPA testimonies, the local myths, all of them, leading to this one forgotten stretch of Carolina lowland. Her colleagues called it superstition. No primary sources, they said. Just ghosts and gossip. But Ruth believed in ghosts, not the kind that walk, but the kind that linger in paper, in dirt, in sound. She arrived with a tape recorder, a notebook, and a borrowed car that coughed smoke with every mile. In her first entry, she wrote, "The people here still speak of light. They don't call it legend. They call it memory." She met an old man by the river. Name was Elijah Kane, last of his family still living on the ancestral ground. His eyes were clouded with cataracts, but his hearing sharp as thunder. When Ruth asked about the rebellion, he smiled slow. "You mean the night the sky opened?" he said. She asked if he believed it happened. "Believe," he laughed. "Child, I live with it. You ever heard a place breathe?" That night, she camped by the edge of the old rice field, microphone pointed toward the dark. The air was thick, full of frogs, crickets, the creak of branches. But just past midnight, the sound changed. The tape would later capture it, a low hum, faint but rhythmic. Not wind, not water. Like footsteps, far away, moving through mud. Then, a single note, a voice rising and falling. It lasted 12 seconds. When she played it for Elijah the next morning, he nodded. "That's them," he said. "They still walk when the rain right." In her report, Ruth noted an unusual stillness around dawn, the kind of quiet that presses against your skull. She wrote about a flicker across the swamp, a glow that hovered pale and slow-moving. "It looked like the light was breathing," she said into the recorder. She followed it barefoot through the wet ground, camera in hand, until it vanished behind the hanging tree. That tree still stood. Its bark split its roots, half-submerged its limbs, heavy with moss. Ruth placed her hand on the trunk and felt heat faint pulsing, as if the wood had a heartbeat. She jerked her hand away, whispering to herself, "The ground remembers what men forgot." Later that day, she found something, a rusted chain, buried shallow in mud, fused into a single twisted shape. She took it back to her car, washed it gently, and laid it across the seat. The metal was cold, then warm, then cold again. That night, she returned to the cabin she rented near the marsh and wrote, "I think I heard them outside. I think they're still trying to finish something." No one heard from her for 3 days after that. When the sheriff finally checked the cabin, they found the recorder still running the tape full. At the beginning, her voice calm academic describing the environment. At the end, silence. And then, a song. Not sung by her, not in her voice. A man's voice, low trembling, old, singing the words, steal away home. Followed by the sound of rain, the crack of thunder, and then another voice, a woman's whispering something that no one could fully make out. The last line clear enough to transcribe, we still hear. The authorities said it was interference, some radio frequency overlapping broadcast. But the tone, the cadence, it was unmistakable. Ruth's notes were collected by the university after her disappearance. Her car was found abandoned near the edge of the marsh driver's door. Open her notebook on the passenger seat. The last line written in ink blurred by rain. When the air hums, they answer. The report closed the case as accidental drowning. But the locals knew better. They said she'd gone too deep, that she'd called the names out loud. And when you call the names call back. Some months later, a group of researchers returned to the site. They found the hanging tree had split in two after a lightning storm, the wood charred black from the inside but untouched on the surface. Beneath it, they discovered something strange. A cluster of stones arranged in a perfect circle, each marked with a carved cross. Beneath one of the stones lay a rusted coin and a small wooden carving of a bird. The bird the same shape described in oral accounts of the rebellion buried by the enslaved under the roots of an oak. The air around the site was so still that their voices seemed to echo. One technician later said the recording equipment malfunctioned. Every audio file they captured played back with a faint background hum, like breathing. He quit the project the following week. What began as research had become something else, a collision of centuries. The rebellion of 1823 was no longer a distant tragedy. It was a living wound, pulsing under the surface of the world that replaced it. The land, the sound, the silence, all part of the same testimony. When the documentary crew returned the following year to film a short piece for PBS, their footage showed something they couldn't explain. At dusk, just as the narrator spoke of the unmarked graves of the forgotten, a pale shimmer crossed the background, faint like heat rising from asphalt, except there was no heat. Just air, moving. In slow motion, the camera caught it, a distortion, shaped like a man walking carrying something in his hand, a staff or a torch. Then gone. The crew laughed at first lens flare exposure shift trick of light, but that night, the sound engineer reviewed the tape and heard something under the narration, a low hum growing, fading, returning, in rhythm. When he compared the waveform to Ruth's old tape, they matched perfectly. That's when the project was shelved. No release, no explanation. The footage archived under the label Georgetown Field Test, 1984, unused. But people talk. One of the interns who worked on the project still remembers that night. He says the director stood by the monitor watching the replay in silence, then whispered, "We filmed them marching." There was no footage after that. The crew left before sunrise. The next day, the swamp was covered in mist thicker than anyone had ever seen. Locals say the mist stayed for 3 days, no wind, no light. And when it cleared, the hanging tree was gone. No stump, no roots, nothing. Just a hollow in the ground filled with black water. To this day, no one has been able to find its exact location again. But every few years, especially when the storms roll through the Carolinas, fishermen on the Santee River claim to hear something under the thunder, a chorus carried in the wind. Some say it's the sound of frogs. Others say it's the wind moving through the reeds. But to those who know the story, it's unmistakable. A rhythm, a song, 1,000 voices rising from the mud. Steal away home. It drifts soft, sorrowful, defiant. And if you close your eyes, you can almost see them. The line of silhouettes moving through mist, their faces calm, their hands empty, their feet light against the ground they once bled into. Not ghosts, not shadows, just souls walking the road they began 2 centuries ago. This is the moment where history and haunting are no longer separate, where every record, every myth, every heartbeat meets in the same breath. The rebellion didn't end in 1823. It never ended. It simply learned to move quietly, through sound, through memory, through the people who still listen. And maybe that's the truth. The archives can't hold that freedom doesn't vanish when the body dies. It just changes form. It walks. It hums. It waits. And the world moved on, but the ground never did. 200 years have passed, new towns, new highways, new names on maps, and yet beneath it all, the same heartbeat remains. You can pave over soil, but you can't bury memory. It breathes through the cracks. It hums beneath the concrete. It waits for rain to wake it. In Georgetown County, the old plantations are gone. The cane fields turned into quiet farmland, the cabins into dust. But if you walk there at dusk, the same hour the rebellion began, something happens. The air grows still. The light turns strange, a soft silver between day and night. And if you stop talking, if you truly listen, you'll hear it. That faint rhythm again, that pulse, the one that never stopped. Locals don't speak much of it now, not publicly. But every June, a few elders gather at the edge of the marsh. No signs, no flyers, no church announcement. Just quiet steps, old hands lighting candles in paper cups. They hum, not sing the melody too sacred to name. It begins with one voice trembling with age, and then another joins, and another, until the night carries the same trembling vibration that once shook the Low Country. They say it's not commemoration, it's communion. Because they're not remembering the dead. They're answering them. One woman, 90 years old, told a journalist in 2002, "They ain't gone nowhere. They just quieter now. They talk when the wind right." And when asked what she meant, she looked toward the horizon and whispered, "You ever hear thunder without rain? That's them. Some call it superstition. Others call it faith. But there's something undeniable about this place, this hum beneath the surface. The scientists tested the soil, said it had high electromagnetic anomalies. The pastors said it was the Lord's power made manifest. The storytellers, they said the ancestors never stopped walking. Each theory, each language reaching for the same truth. Fact says the rebellion was lost. Folklore says it was fulfilled. And maybe both are right, because history always measures victory by survival. But sometimes survival is simply remembrance. Ruth Hensley's field tapes, the ones recovered from her abandoned car, are now stored in the Howard University Archive Box 14, Folder 3. Scholars still debate the authenticity of the last recording. But when played on good speakers in a quiet room, you can hear something at the edge of perception, the faint harmony of overlapping voices. Some say it's water dripping, some say static. But if you listen long enough, you'll swear you hear words. We still hear. Those 3 words became a phrase repeated by later generations, whispered in marches, painted on signs, sung in church choirs across the South. We still hear. Not defiant, just true. In 2019, a memorial committee proposed marking the site of the 1823 rebellion with a plaque. It was rejected twice. Too controversial, they said. Too uncertain. Not enough verifiable data. But history doesn't ask permission. It seeps. It resurfaces. A few months later, heavy rain swept through Georgetown County, one of the worst floods in years. When the waters receded, something emerged from the mud. Rusted iron fused into the shape of a circle, fragments of glass blackened as if by ancient fire. The find was documented by a local museum. But when displayed under light, the objects reflected not dull brown, but faint silver shimmering like heat. They called it unexplained oxidation. The locals called it a sign. And then there were the songs, the ones passed down for generations, sung by freedmen's choirs, transformed by time, but never erased. Each melody carried traces of that night, the rhythm of footsteps, the rising hum, the fire in their throats. You can hear it in gospel recordings from the 1920s, in the cadence of civil rights hymns from the 1960s, in the whispered chants of protests today. The rebellion never ended, it just changed tempo. A historian once said that the South is a land haunted not by ghosts, but by memory. That every field, every river, every whisper of wind carries the echo of something undone. And maybe he was right, because when you stand in the low country at night, there's a stillness that feels alive. Like the land is listening for a name. Somewhere under that quiet lie the bones of the forgotten men, women, and children who stood for one night against empire and silence. They were never given graves. But every time their story is spoken, every time their song is heard, they rise again, if only for a moment. The elders say the ancestors walk where they are remembered, that each word spoken in truth builds a bridge not from past to present, but from silence to sound. And that is what this story has always been about, not revenge, not glory, but sound. The sound of chains breaking, the sound of a voice finding itself, the sound of freedom still unfinished, still echoing. And maybe that's why the swamp hums even now, because the land isn't haunted by the dead. It's haunted by the living, who still haven't listened. Now, if you ever find yourself near Georgetown on a quiet night when the air smells of rain and the moon hangs low, go to the edge of the water. Stand still. Don't speak. Just listen. You'll hear the same hum Ruth heard, the same rhythm the soldiers feared, the same pulse that carried Miriam, Isaac, Joseph, and every name lost to history through that night. It won't be loud. It'll come like breath-steady, low, patient. And when it reaches you, it'll feel less like sound and more like remembering. And maybe that's the closest thing to truth we'll ever have. Not the records, not the reports, not the ledgers, but the echo that refuses to fade. The cry that crossed centuries, still singing through the soil. You just heard a record from a history that never closed. The night they tried to erase still burns quietly in the dark. Every storm that passes, every song that rises, carries a trace of their defiance. Before you go, tell me where you're watching from, and what the air sounds like tonight where you are, because somewhere may be closer than you think. The wind is carrying their story. The rebellion never ended. It just learned to whisper.